Shalom Aleichem, Erev Tov to you wherever you are in the world right now. We are continuing in the introduction of Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine to his Keter Shem Tov Volume 3. The last 2 weeks we focused on a theme in which we find Maran Shulchan Aruch ruling halacha according to the rabbis of the Talmud, being loyal to traditional Jewish understanding of halacha, and the Rama being not just innovative, but very often lenient, more lenient or permissive than that which the law actually allows for. We did Shulchan Aruch and we covered Shulchan Aruch Yoreh De'ah. We are now going to find ourselves in Shulchan Aruch Even HaEzer, and touching a little bit on the introduction to Chosh Mishpat, but Chosh Mishpat, God willing, we will leave until next week, B'ezrat Hashem. For right now, I am in the Roman numerals on page 27, which would be 25 in your PDF of the Keter Shem Tov, and that will be found in the link that I posted in the chat box. In the middle of the page, Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine is going to bring up 2 points, which actually might be relevant to the parashiyot that we're reading right now in the book of Bereshit, and I'm sure there's questions that come up every year in every place about the different things that we read about in the Torah and that maybe don't really fit with our model of marriage and divorce and children and other things that we're familiar with here in the West. The first halakha that Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine wants to point out, it actually comes later than the second one, but let's start there. That's where he starts. If you see in the middle of the page, it says Sham Siman Kuf Nun Zayin Seif Dalet. Look in Even HaEzer 157 halakha 4. Linyan Yivama. Let's talk about Yivama for a moment. What is a Yivama? Someone walk me through the laws of Yibum briefly, nothing complicated. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'akol nהיה b'doro.
If a man marries a woman and he dies childless, his wife falls as a Yivama to his brother, I think the oldest brother in the family, and she would marry him, and then the first child that they would have would be considered the dead brother's child, not the live brother's child, I guess, to continue his line, to continue his particular family tree branch, I guess.
Very good. So if a woman is married to a man, and they don't have children together, and this man dies, she becomes a Yivama, means she has an obligation to marry the brother of her husband, the deceased husband, so that his family name can continue, whatever else you mentioned is correct. And this situation of Yibum, which is practiced in Sephardic communities, or maybe not anymore as it used to be, but has been replaced in Ashkenazi communities almost exclusively by always performing chalitza. What is chalitza? Unusual pisukim in the Torah. Someone walked with, I once saw chalitza in my life in a bedin. One of the most unusual things I've ever seen in my life. Someone tell me what happens in chalitza. What is chalitza?
No, it's when it's when the woman doesn't want to marry the man. When the man doesn't want to marry the woman. Sorry, they go to Bet Din, and for Bet Din, he off the top of my head, he makes there's a whole ritual. He puts on a sandal on his foot. She takes off the sandal. I think she spits and she says, "This is what happens to the man that doesn't want to continue again the line of his brother, his brother's name in Israel." And that is the process that would then now free her from being a Yivama, and she would now be free to marry whoever she wants.
Correct. And so that's a wonderful explanation. And therefore, in Ashkenazi communities that do chalitza, really Yibum never becomes a thing. They opt out of the mitzvah of Yibum and can constantly do chalitza, which seems to be the general practice in many Batei Din around the world, which I'm not coming to discuss today, whether we should do Yibum or should do chalitza, or should adopt one standard. Rav Uziel wanted to perhaps give up on Yibum in order to unite everyone around chalitza because of Rav Kook. That led to attacks from Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who claimed Rav Uziel was a sellout to Rav Kook, and that led to a very interesting conversation in rabbinic circles. Not for right now. For right now, the halakha is focusing on is a halakha about Yibum, which is found in Siman Kuf Nun Zayin Siv Dalet. Linyan Yibama Shenafla Lifnei Mumar. There's a lady. She is married to a man. He passes away, and the brother who is remaining to marry her is a mumar. What is a mumar? Give me a loose definition of a mumar. It doesn't have to be exact.
It's not religious, no?
Yeah, he's a heretic. He doesn't believe in the Torah. Doesn't believe in Torah mitzvot. Mumar could also be somebody who converts out to another faith, possibly. There's obviously a pikoros, there's a kofel, there's a mumar. Not all these categories are exactly the same. Let's just say mumar from now on. So this is a man who's not really within the Jewish fold. יכול לקדש ולהתנות בתנאי כפול שאם תיפול לפני המומר לייבום שלא תהיה מקודשת. The Rama suggests a radical idea that someone can make a special type of tanai, a special type of double condition here, in which she marries her husband only on condition that if he dies childless, she does not have an obligation to marry the brother who is a mumar. Rama mentions this. Maran בבית יוסף כתב, Maran בבית יוסף writes, ישתקע הדבר ולא יאמר. This matter should just be completely forgotten and never spoken about again. It means entirely incorrect. Now you should know in the Bet Yosef that I have, and I'm going to show you just a moment. In the Bet Yosef that's in front of me, the last two words they're not found there. But it's very possible that Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine either had a different edition, or he was borrowing language from another place in Shulchan Aruch. In Yoreh De'ah Kuf Lamed Daled, Maran says this word Yishtaka v'lo Yamar. But we are going to look at this inside for just a moment. It's an area of halakha which most of us are probably not so proficient in. This is not my area of halakha per se, so I'm just going to walk you through a few different sources in there. If you go to the Zoom invitation, you will see that there's a link to my source sheet, Expanding Horizons, Even HaEzer on Sefaria. Please click that source sheet. We're going to be using it heavily today. So Maran writes Shulchan Aruch, מי שיש לו אח מאביו, אפילו הוא ממזר או עובד עבודת כוכבים. Somebody who has a brother from his father, even if he's a mamzer, an illegitimate child, or he's an idol worshiper. ואפילו הוא קטן, even if he's a child, a minor. משיצא ראשו ורובו לאוויר העולם קודם שימות אחיו, if the majority of his body was born, which is a very technical definition, before his brother dies, הרי זה זוקק. This man causes the wife of the brother, זוקק את אשתו לייבום. It causes the wife to become connected to him in ייבום. אפילו הוא גוסס או פצוע מכות שאינו יכול לחיות מהם. Even if he's terribly injured or he's on his deathbed and he's not able to live even for very long. לא תנסה כל זמן שהוא חי, she should not get married so long as he's alive. אבל הוא אחיו מאמו או שנולד אחר מותו, יבמתו מותרת השוק. But if he's a maternal brother, or he was born after his brother died, then she's free to anyone that she chooses. וכן אם היה לו אח מהשפחה או מהנוכרית, אינו זוקק את אשתו, אף על פי שהייתה לידתו בקדושה, הואיל והורתו הייתה שלא בקדושה. This is an interesting section connected to gerim, not relevant right now for us. There are other people that are not exactly connected to Yibum, but here what do you see? If the brother is even an idol worshiper, then here there would be an obligation of Yibum. Nobody's telling you it's a good idea for her to marry an idol worshiper, but there's no exemption of Yibum just because the brother is an idol worshiper. Now skip 4 halachot down, so that's halakha 2. Nafla lifnei yabam mumar. Maran writes, if she falls into the lot of a yabam who's a mumar, like we mentioned above, yesh mi shematir, there's somebody who says that she is free. Im haya mumar shenasa achiv ve'nismoch alav. If he was a mumar when the brother was married, Ve'en lismoch alav. And you should not rely on this opinion. So Maran is quoting an opinion, but what's the purpose of quoting this opinion? Very good. To tell you that you cannot follow it. So Maran is intentionally not ignoring this opinion. He's quoting this opinion only to tell you that it's prohibited to follow it. Says the Rama, mihu, nonetheless, im avra v'niset b'lo chalitza ki lo yada'a shaya yabam v'achar noda sheyesh yabam mumar lo tetzeh. If she got married to somebody else because she had no idea that she even had a brother from that side of the family, and then we find out she has a brother, and that he has a brother, and then we find out that he's a mumar, she doesn't have to divorce her second husband. And at the bottom he writes, "V'mekadesh isha," someone who marries a wife, v'yesh lo ach mumar, and he has a brother who is a mumar, יכול לקדש להתנות בתנאי כפול שאם תיפול לפני מומר ליבם שתהיה מקודשת. He can make a special type of clause in his ketubah that says that my wife is marrying me unless I die before I have children, in which case she'll have to marry my brother who's a mumar. In order for that not to happen, my kiddushin, my marriage, is only on the basis that this will never happen. If I die and she has to marry him, my kiddushin retroactively shouldn't even be considered a marriage. So she's entirely an unmarried lady, and we were just living together. Understand this? How this works? I mean, he's saying now, if I die, my marriage is not really a marriage. You should know there were many solutions given to what they call today the Aguna Crisis. And here you see rabbinic creativity in Ashkenaz, which is clearly blatantly violating halakha, but just for the moment, you see that they were not afraid to help out a woman from getting stuck with a guy who converted to another faith. So what happened now? All of a sudden, the ladies that are actually stuck and they're miserable for years and years and years and years. There were solutions. Rabbis didn't like the solutions. I agree. Fine, you don't like those solutions. Come up with better ones. But you can't ignore the parasha entirely. You can't just say the problem is not a problem. We don't want to deal with this problem. We don't have the ability to deal with it. We don't care about dealing with this problem. Those are all excuses instead of dealing with an actual problem. Now I will say there's more to the Aguna problem than solving the text of a ketubah or trying to figure out a way to absolve a marriage retroactively. There's a fundamental issue in the way the Jewish community operates and the way Batei Din don't function anymore. Those are fundamental issues that we'll need to fix if we ever wish for people to feel safe relying on Jewish legal texts with a broken Jewish legal system. But the topic of agunot is it's not for today. I would love to talk to you about it. Today is not the right day for that. Before we get into the Bet Yosef, I want to just clarify here. Maran quotes the opinion that the Rama is talking about, and he says you just can't do it. It doesn't work. It doesn't make a difference. Who cares that the brother's a mumah? She's still required to go through a process of yibum. Maran, obviously, his Shulchan Aruch is a summary of the halachot that he has in the Bet Yosef. Bet Yosef is a commentary on the tool. Where the tool, he wrote really the first Shulchan Aruch, and Maran wrote a commentary to Bet Yosef. The Rama wrote a commentary called Darchei Moshe. Darchei Moshe and the Bet Yosef ultimately become Shulchan Aruch and the Rama. So let's read. By the way, there is a place where a mumar makes a difference in halakha. Look in halakha 3. Yivama shnishara skuka lebet achim. A yivama who is obligated to do yibum with one of two brothers. There's two brothers left over. V'gadol hu manusei hazman, v'ashani Yehudi. And the first one is an anus. I'm not sure what Maran is saying, anusim, if it's like the anusim of Spain, or just he's one of the people who forfeited his faith because of whatever's going on in any generation. V'ashani Yehudi. And the second one is a kosher Jew. Ha-Yehudi kodem nachalot. The elder goes ahead and he frees her. The Jewish one goes and frees her. Vim kadam ha'acher v'chalatz utra lashuk. And if the other one did chalitza, she's free. And Rama says again, look what was written in Siv Daled regarding my opinion that a mumar doesn't need chalitza in the first place. The Tur, he quotes this halakha before Maran, and let's say halfway down the Tur, he says, Katav Rav Shrer HaGaon. Rav Shrer HaGaon writes in the middle of that big paragraph, Nafla lifnei mumar. She falls into the seika, into the yibum of a mumar. Skuka liyabem. Umitagna ad chalitzla. She's required to go through yibum, that's the law, and she's stuck. She's really an aguna until he's willing to do chalitza for her. Rav Yehuda katav, and Rav Yehuda says, that if when she got married, the husband's brother was already a mumar, she doesn't require chalitza. Okay, this is already something else. And then says here, the two, ולא ידענה למה לא תהיה אשת מומר זקוקה ליבם וגם מה חילוק יש בין אם היה יבם מומר כשנישאת או לא. Says, I don't know why that makes a difference here. It says, I don't understand why a person being a mumar exempts somebody from yibum. If you look down into the Bet Yosef, the Bet Yosef quotes this in section 5, and he's quoting the different opinions back and forth about yibum. And he says, go down almost towards the last third of it. The Rashba is bewildered with this opinion of Rav Yehuda that a mumar exempts one from doing yibum. That if a person has a brother who's an idol worshipper, he's still required to do yibum. So why should a brother who's a mumar be any different in that case? ולא חילק אם היה עובד כוכבים אותו בשעת הנישואין בין המיר אחר כך וכל שגם דבר מומר ואח כשר שאימת שיזכויה לחליצה ויבום כל דבר רשב"א ז"ל. Says really this doesn't make much sense, but then he continues in the next section, section 6. ומה שכתב רבנו, that which רבנו הטור, he says לא ידענה למה תהיה אשת מומר זקוקה לייבום. ודאי קושטא דמילתא הכי. For sure he's correct, that's the truth of the matter. דאשת מומר זקוקה לייבום, that a wife of a mumar for sure requires ייבום. Even if he does kiddushin after he gives birth. So listen to this. There's a guy, he converts out of the Jewish faith, and then he marries a Jewish wife. That wedding is still a valid wedding. He's still Jewish enough for his kiddushin to work. And he goes again through an arichut, and at the end here, he's bewildered entirely how this opinion could even exist. Look in Halakha 7. ומה שכתב רבנו דלא ידע מה חילוק יש בין אם היה יבם מומר כשנישאת או לא. Says that which Rabbeinu Atul doesn't understand what difference does it make when he became mumar, which time he became mumar. He goes again through a lengthy conversation, and towards the end of this he writes the following words. Look, somewhere in the middle here, there's a colon. It says Siman Kuf Nun Tet, there's a colon, and it says יש נוהגים להתנות בשעת קידושין שלא תזקק לייבם אם תיפול לפניו. Some, by a brother who's a mumar, they put a t'nai in the kiddushin, that's what the Rama was quoting, a condition in the ketubah that says that she won't be married. וצריך עיון בדבר, and one requires analysis in this matter. Because it doesn't seem that that could work. בתלמוד הדידן לא משמע הכי, it doesn't seem that according to our Talmud that this can actually work. And says Maran towards the end, Vani tameh, this is like the last 5 lines of that Bet Yosef in 7. Vani tameh, that I am so astonished, bewildered, troubled by this. Machar she'en ha'eter mevar b'talmud hadidan. In our Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, there is no leniency for skipping ibum with a mumar, or making such an exception in the ketubah. And the Jerusalem Talmud says explicitly that this is prohibited. How can you be lenient about something that is prohibited? ועל נשתקע הדבר, ולא ראינו ולא שמענו מי שיזנקן. He says, this matter should be completely forgotten. We have never seen and we have never heard anybody who allowed someone to do this, the halakha. So back to our book. Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine tells us that here is a matter that has to do with marriage and divorce, nibum and chalitza. The Torah is clear, the Talmud is clear, and along comes the Rama, and he relies on an opinion that is so vague, by the way. There's interesting, maybe I'll read you one more section. I don't want to skip it. Let me just see if I can find it for you. This is a different edition of the tour than I regularly have in front of my face. I apologize, it's in front of me, but I can't. Here. If you look in section 6 in the Bet Yosef, I'm going to try to find you the place where you could start reading it. Maran says something interesting. And this is something that is relevant to our generation, when all kinds of proclamations come out from all kinds of rabbis about all kinds of things. Says Maran, V'yesh li temoha, it should surprise anybody, al mi she'ala al da'ato heter zeh, that anybody can even allow a leniency in such a matter. V'harav Yehuda shenichtav b'shmo eini tameh. And I don't have any questions or any critiques on Rabbi Yehuda that this was written in his name. Why don't I have any critiques about it? Shenichtav b'shmo, because it was written in his name. Mishum degmire de meor enayim hava, because we know that his eyes were full of light. Maran is speaking b'lashon sagin naho. Maran is speaking literally. Maran is speaking in a language that is very kind. What does it mean? His eyes were full of light. He was blind. He wasn't able to see, or at least not well. And sometimes his students used to write things in his name that he never would have fathomed writing down. He says, so I have a question not on Rabbi Yehuda, because maybe he never said this. I'm bewildered at the students who wrote this down. And I'm even more perplexed at the Baal HaYitur, shehetik divrehem, that he copied their words. Says Maran, instead of chasing them down and erasing these words, he chose to copy these words as if it's some type of authoritative legal position. Here, Maran is telling you that you don't have to even blame. It's not that Rabbi Yehuda is wrong. He made up an opinion. Perhaps his opinion is not even an opinion. It has no basis in Talmudic literature, and you definitely should not rely on this opinion in the halakha. The fact that the Rama is willing to say, well, it's a minority opinion, we can rely on this minority opinion when we need to, goes against everything that people say about the Rama, and definitely shows you that in a matter that is as serious as marriage, divorce, yibum, and chalitza, that the Rama is extremely lenient, and that is the custom. What did he write? This is the custom in the place where we are at, that we are not careful about this halakha. That's example number 1 from Even HaEzer. Example number 2 might be a little more disturbing. I don't want anyone to be offended from it. Allow me to read it and explain it, and hopefully after explaining it, there'll be a little more clarity. Whether you like it or not, I can't help, but at least a little bit of clarity in what is that halakha. So, go with me to the next source. And that is on my Expanding Horizon source sheet. And it should be source 9. Okay, so source 9 in the source sheet. Over here, we're going to be talking about a halakha that is sensitive. I was debating whether it should be recorded or not. I don't want to make Chilu Hashem anywhere, but I trust everybody here, so please do with it whatever you will. In Halacha 9. The Rambam writes in the Mishneh Torah, Ha'av mekadesh et bito shelo ledata kol zaman shehi ketana. A father can marry off his daughter, though she has no ability to give consent, so long as she's a minor. Then even when she gets a little bit older than that, he's able to marry her off. וכן הוא זכאי במציאתה ובמעשייתה ובכתובתה אם נתגרשה או נתאלמנה מן אירוסין, הוא זכאי בכל עד שתתבגר. He is able, essentially, all of her possessions, or ktubah, or divorce, all of that is his until she gets old enough to stand on her own. לפיכך מקבל האב קידושי ביתו מיום שתיוולד עד שתתבגר. A father is able, therefore, to accept marriage on behalf of his daughter from the day that she's born until she gets older. ואפילו הייתה חירשת או שוטה, even if she was deaf or she was a shota, she was mentally not sound. וקידשה האב, and the father marries her off, הרי היא אשת איש גמורה, she's completely a married lady. ואם הייתה בת 3 שנים ויום אחד, מתקדשת בביאה מידת אביה, and from the age of 3 years and 1 day, technically, she's able to be married by actually consummating that marriage through a sexual act. פחות מכן, אם קידשה אביה בביאה אינה מקודשת, but less than that, it wouldn't work. This halakha obviously raises deep questions in us about the ability of a father to make decisions for a daughter, especially one that is unable to make decisions for herself. More than that, even if a daughter was able to make decisions for herself, then it leads to difficult conversations regarding age of consent, marriage, at what age. These are talking about minors that are clearly being married to somebody that is able to have sexual relations and the like. I don't want to get to today conversations surrounding why Chachamim don't necessarily have laws in play about underage minors, which age, there are things that in our world we are much more sensitive to. I'm not saying fault in the eyes of Chachamim, rather, before you jump on me for the halakha of the Rambam, let's read these halachot in their entirety, and I think it might shed some light on what all of us are feeling. Even HaEzer, Maran writes very similarly. In fact, it's almost word for word. Let's look at Halakha 11. The Gemara is the source for all of this. The Gemara Masech Kiddushin teaches, it's a Mishnah really, Ha'ish mekadesh et bito k'shi na'ara en k'shi ktana, לא מסייע לי לרב דאמר, רב יהודה אמר רב, ויתמה רבי אלעזר, אסור לאדם שיקדש את ביתו כשהיא קטנה, עד שתגדל ותאמר בפלוני אני רוצה. A man can marry his daughter off when she's a young woman. But then there's a statement of our rabbis that says, אסור לאדם, it's forbidden for a man, שיקדש את ביתו, to marry off his daughter, כשהיא קטנה, while she's a minor, עד שתגדל, until she's old enough to say, v'tomar bifloni ani rotza, that I want to marry this man. What's happening here? Is it permitted to marry off a minor, or it's prohibited to marry off a minor?
It's permitted.
It's permitted. Yeah, it's not allowed.
It's allowed or not allowed?
I think it's allowed.
That's what it says in the beginning. No, ha'ish mekadesh b'to k'shi na'ara. A man can marry off his daughter.
Can it be that from a financial transaction, it would be considered legally binding, but from an ethical position, it wouldn't be correct?
You're saying there's something more ethical than...
Give her consent.
It's up until the point where she can make up her mind.
Let's look at the next halakha in the Rambam. He'll clarify the seemingly contradictory Gemara. Says the Rambam Mishneh Torah in the Laws of Marriage, chapter 3. Mitzvah shikadesh adam tishto ba'atzmo yoter ma'yidei shlucho. It is better for a person, like most mitzvot, that you should do the act of the mitzvah instead of delegating it to somebody else. So you can technically send a ketubah, a ring, a witness, someone to do the act of marriage, not actual marriage, but the marriage, to marry someone for you, but it's better that you should do it on your own. And the same thing is true, it's better for a woman to get married directly and not by proxy. And even though, according to the Torah, a man has permission to marry off his minor daughter, and when she's a young lady, also to whoever he wants, it's not the right thing to do that, says the Rambam. Our rabbis added a mitzvah. Our rabbis commanded us that a man should not marry off his daughter when she's a minor, here he says, until she gets older, and she should say, Lifloni ani rotza, I want to marry this man. So what happened right now? The Torah says that a man has the ability to marry off his minor daughter. What do Chachamim say?
It's better not to do that.
It's not more than it's better not to. It's not the right thing. It's not the right thing that a man should do that to his daughter. You have to wait until the age in which she can pick her own spouse. And then there's a flip halacha here. Our rabbis also warn a man against it's improper for a man to marry a young girl. It's not the right thing to do. And then there's another halacha. A man should not, sorry to the fiddler on the roof, a man should not marry a woman until he sees her. And she should be fitting in his eyes. Because if you just arrange a marriage and two people get married under the chuppah, he'll end up divorcing her at the very least. I don't know which is worse actually. He'll be married to her and he'll live with her while he hates her, despises her. That's not a good outcome. Therefore, Chachamim added a few halachot here as safeguards to everybody in this marriage. One, a father, though he may, should not marry off a minor who's his daughter. He shouldn't do it. They should wait until the age in which she's able to choose a spouse. Halakha number 2, a man should not marry someone who is a minor, even though the Torah technically allows for such a marriage. 3, the third halakha, is that a man should not marry a woman unless he knows her and is willing to marry her, wants to marry her. Because arranging such a marriage could lead either to divorce or to a relationship in which two people suffer tremendously inside of it. It's at this point that I tell you that there's a reason that we are Pharisees, we are rabbinic Jews. What did Paul say in the New Testament? I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. I am a Benjamite, the son of a Benjamite. Yeah, we're also proud to be Pharisees. I think very often in the Jewish world, those rabbis, the rabbis, everyone hates the rabbis. The people don't understand. Chachmei Israel are the ones that came to us with a Torah that is beautiful. A Torah that says, listen, technically you could do all kinds of things. We don't want it to happen. You can imagine if an action is severely discouraged by the rabbinic establishment. You're not going to be able to walk into their bedin and marry a 2-year-old. It's just not going to work that way. Technically, would a marriage work if somebody had done it in a renegade fashion in the backyard? Yeah, it would work. It would be chal. But our rabbis were absolutely against it. And therefore they created a Jewish society in which you never heard of such things. But it's an intentional improvement that our rabbis added here. Maran rules this halakha in Even HaEzer. Mitzvah shaloi kadesh bito. He says it a little differently. He says it's a mitzvah for a man not to marry off his daughter ketana while she's a minor, until she grows older, v'tomar, and she says, bifloni ani rotza, I want to marry this guy. That's number 13 in the source sheet. What does the Rama say? Rama says, yesh omrim, some say, dinohagin bezman hazeh lekadesh benotenu haketanot. That nowadays we have a custom, yes, to marry off our minor daughters. But the ketanot, you're talking about 3 years old, maybe even under. then that's our custom. Mishum she'anu begalut, because we are in exile. What does being in exile have to do with marrying off your daughters at the age of 3, 4, 5, 6?
Because people had to do it in some places in order to avoid their daughters getting taken or kidnapped by other people who would have been exploiting them. And I think that kind of speaks to what you were saying before about how it's not really like a good thing to do under ordinary circumstances, but it was left in the Torah as a possibility for extenuating circumstances where it was necessary to prevent worse harm. And also, not necessarily did the people who did it necessarily live together.
Okay,
I know people, grandparents who, his grandmothers and grandfathers were this way, that the parents married them off when they were young children, but they didn't necessarily live together. It was like a marriage on paper until they got old enough. It was more of a legal remedy for them to avoid a worse outcome.
Okay, so you're mentioning, for example, what was common in Yemen. I'll give you an example in Yemen. By the Muslims, they were able to take, especially orphans, children who didn't have parents to protect them. They would simply see them, take them as a wife off the street, and convert them to Islam. A way around that was that in the Muslim world, they're very careful only to kidnap children that are not married. Baruch Hashem, if the children are married, they don't kidnap them as readily. And so because of that, our rabbis in Yemen, for example, agreed that certain children, especially those who were orphans, this is a specific scenario, should get married or at least spoken for at a very young age. Though they never lived together, they probably didn't even see each other or know each other. Haikal was, you could say, this girl is already ready to get married or she has already been married. Which leads to a second part of this conversation, which is even among the cases in which a man could marry a minor. But it could work the other way around too. There are other such halachot. Chachamim tell us, just like a old man shouldn't marry a young woman, an old woman shouldn't marry a young man. Now, what is old and young? It's a great question. I'm sure all of you are familiar with people who have some type of age gap. Our Chachamim are not saying you can't marry somebody a few years younger than you or older than you. Chachamim were concerned about exactly what it is that we're talking about here. Even in relationships, marriages that started off that way, it was not a sexual relationship at the time in which a person was a minor. This was a relationship in which somebody says, we're married, I'm now transferring care of this child from their parents to me, to my home, to my place. And I'll explain in just a moment why that happens. The Rama is going to tell us, not because of Muslims or because of the neighbors, something very fascinating. We marry off our minor daughters, mishum she'anu begalut, because we're in exile. Ve'en lanu tamid sipuk kedei tzorchei nedunya. Because we don't have enough money to pay the dowry. It's famous that in years gone by, to get married, you had to pay a lot of money. In Yemen, where my grandfather got married, he had to pay a lot of money to marry my grandmother. But in Ashkenaz, oftentimes that worked the other way around. It seems to me that in very traditional Ashkenazi circles, this is still the case. It's on the girl's family to provide a significant amount of money to cover the marriage that is between her and the young man. So if you want to imagine in classic Haredi models in Israel that still toe this line, it is an expected thing that the mother and father of the bride will not just pay for a wedding and furniture and all of those things, but will buy them an apartment and will expect to support them for the first 3, 5, 6, 10 years. And Kol Rabbanit, correct me at any point if I'm incorrect.
No, you should have married somebody Haredi. That way we could have had an apartment.
I'm pretty sure I aimed for the most fanatical element of that society, but it didn't work to my liking. So in any case, Baruch Hashem, this situation was one of, we're not going to have enough money to pay the dowry if we wait until she's old enough to get married. There's too much pressure in Ashkenaz, too much financial pressure to be able to marry off our children. Might find this to be difficult to believe. My wife and I know some very talented young women, mostly in the East Coast and the Haredi community there, who are simply unable not to get married but they're unable even to get a call back from the shadchan or the shadchanit because their parents don't make enough money. You don't have enough money to get married. In this way, I once told someone that the non-Jewish world, or perhaps the non-observant Jewish world, is light years ahead of the Orthodox Jewish community in this regard. You read about the princess in Japan marrying some kind of peasant that she can't marry. I don't think he's really a peasant, obviously, but she's not allowed to do such a thing. Two people can't just meet and get married. But in the world at large, you could be the CEO of a company and walk into a bar and meet some guy over there at the counter, and he's the bartender, whatever it is, and those two people get married. Why? Because they decided they wanted to get married. Because those two people decided, hey, I want to marry you, you want to marry me, shalom on Israel, shalom on Ishmael. But this is something that two people can decide they want to do. In the world in which you don't have enough money to even be given a date, because your parents can't buy him an apartment because they can't even buy themselves an apartment. So then don't expect to get married. Just expect to be single, or we'll find you some guy who's 40 years, I'm not exaggerating, 40 years older than you, divorced with 4 kids, and maybe you can marry him. Because he already has an apartment from the first marriage. It's an ugly thing. I didn't come to speak today about the Shidduch crisis either, but this issue is something that's not new in the Ashkenazi community at least. The Rama is saying we know that if we wait for our daughter to get older, we won't have enough money for a dowry. So anybody who'll take her now, you want to take my daughter? Take her, because I won't be able to afford marrying her off later. At least she'll be in good hands. Gam anu mete me'at. He gives a second reason. Our community is so few in number. This is in a time where Ashkenazi Jews were not necessarily the majority of the Jewish community like it is today. There was a time where the numbers were swapped. Because there are so few of us Ashkenazi Jews. Ve'en motzim tamid zivug hagun. That we can't always find a person, a spouse, that is fitting for us. And therefore, v'chen nohagin, and that is the custom in Ashkenaz to marry off our daughters at a very, very, very young age. Very, meaning 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And it amazes me every single time I hear rabbis today in contemporary orthodoxy of whichever flavor you subscribe to talk about, in Sephardic countries, people got married so young, and da-da-da-da. This is an explicit Rama in the Shulchan Aruch that minors, 2, 3, 4, 5-year-olds were being married off because there was no choice. Because maybe we'll never find a guy for them. Or if we'll find a guy, we won't be able to afford it. And this is mamash against the words of our rabbis. Our rabbis do not allow for such a thing. Mitzvah sheloi kadesh b'tok shektana. Maran says mitzvah for us not to marry off our daughters when they're small, until they're able to choose a spouse for themselves. I want to read you from the Pnei Halacha, and I have my reservations about the Pnei Halacha. I happen to think that Rabbi HaEzer Melamed is a tremendous Tamicham. I respect a lot of what he's actually done recently in the world, where most people are now burning his books and trying to get rid of them. If you're familiar with the crisis that's going on in his life right now, and his openness to trying to help the reform and conservative movements find common ground with orthodoxy in Israel, which I find to be a blessed endeavor. You may agree or disagree with methods, I do as well, but Talmid Chacham is choosing to make strides. He's allowed to do that. He has the authority to do that as Talmid Chacham. Nonetheless, I'm not exactly from the Bet Midrash of the Pnei Halacha, but I think he did a very, very good job at explaining the situation here. And Baruch Hashem, today, the books of Pnei Halacha, he offers them in English, Hebrew and English, and they're free online, so even if you can't afford to buy them, you can read them on Safaria. Let's just click on the source, and if we can actually go to that, I'm wondering if we could, is there a way to open up the source from a source sheet?
Yeah, just click on the title.
On the title, thank you. It doesn't work for me on an iPad. Okay, let me read to you what he writes in English here. In times of dire poverty, many families were forced to marry off their daughters while they were still girls in order to ensure their future, to make sure they would not go hungry, and so they would have the privilege of raising a family. Therefore, the Torah permitted a father to marry off his daughter while she was still a minor, under the age of 12. However, when there was no existential need to marry off minors, the sages prohibited doing so, saying, a man may not marry off his daughter while she is still young. Rather, he must wait until she has matured and is able to say, I choose this one. It's clear that Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine does not understand this the way Rabbi HaEzer Malamed does, and he doesn't view Chachamim saying don't marry off your daughter when she's a minor as saying when there's no existential need, you don't marry her off, but when there is, you can. It seems that he is understanding it differently, but the footnote on this halakha is even more interesting. More, tell me how you said I get there. I click on this. Forgive me, guys. I'm not the.
Click on where it says Priya Lacha, and the Hebrew and English. Just click on the actual line.
It doesn't work, but I'm gonna pull it up anyways here. Guys, does it work for you?
Yeah, it works for me.
Okay, if it works for you, then call it kavod. Okay. So if you look in the footnote there, I think it's footnote number 9. It's like italics towards the end of that paragraph. Do you see what I'm reading from? At first glance? At first glance, this halakha seems self-contradictory. On one hand, the Torah allows a father to marry off his daughter from the moment she is born until she reaches adulthood. With his acceptance of kiddushin money from the groom, who must be at least 13 years old, she becomes a wife. On the other hand, the sages state a man may not marry off his daughter while she is still young, rather he must wait until she has matured and is able to say, I choose this one. In order to understand this halakha, we must be aware that until recently, earning a living generally involved working at hard physical labor all day. You have to understand, this is Pnei Halakha trying to explain a halakha. So you can accept or not accept, I just want to read to you his explanation. Therefore, women were existentially dependent on men. When times were difficult, a young woman's parents would need to provide a large dowry so that a man would agree to marry her and commit to providing for her. That's exactly the opposite of how it happened in most Sephardic countries. If they did not do so, they had reason to fear that their daughter would remain alone without a husband, children, or income. Sometimes, when the parents received a marriage proposal from an upright man from a good family, they would hasten to marry off their daughter to him, even while she was still a minor, while they still had money for a dowry. They were afraid that if she waited until she was grown, they would be unable to find her a decent husband or provide her with a suitable dowry. Sometimes, when the parents' financial situation was dire, the only way left for them to save their daughter from starvation and to secure her future was to marry her off young to a successful man. You're talking about European Jewish families who are unable to feed their family. They don't have food to bring home to their children. Someone is saying, let me take your child in. I'll take them in, I'll feed them, I'll clothe them, I'll take care of them, I'll take a load of this parnasah off your back. Therefore, the Torah permitted a father to marry off his minor daughter. This explanation is offered by Tosafot. Yeah, let's just be aware that this comes from France and Germany, and do with that information what you wish. Stating 800 years ago, quote, because each and every day the exile worsens. If a man has the ability to provide his daughter with a dowry now, he should do so because he may not have the means to do so later, and his daughter will remain alone forever. Understand the calculation here. It's Tosafot's calculation that it's better to marry off your 3-year-old to a 13-year-old than to let her be single forever. Which, being single forever, by the way, is like the worst curse you can bestow on any Jewish mother in the world. Right? This is essentially the biggest fear that they have, and all that, they say that once there was a guy that every time he'd go to a family wedding, his aunts and uncles would come by and say, Mirza Hashem, soon by you, Mirza Hashem, soon by you. And he just kept so annoyed. Every time he came, they're still wondering why he's not married, Mirza Hashem, soon by you. They're all blessing him. Soon he should get married also. Finally, he tells his cousin, I'm not coming to these events anymore. I don't want to be here. I can't handle the pressure. It's too much. I'm happy being single. I'm not looking to get married. And he stops coming to family events. Maybe 5 years passed. And he starts showing up at every event. Bar mitzvahs, weddings. And not only does he show up, but nobody tells him anything. Nobody bothers him, no pressure. It's like somehow the guy has managed to get everybody off his back. So his younger cousin says, listen, tell me what was the secret. What did he do? He said, you remember Aunt Irma and Uncle Bernie? He said, yeah, by the last funeral we were at in the family, I went over and I told them, Yimirtzeh Hashem, soon by you. And ever since then, they left me alone. This teaching here of Tosafot is a fear. It's a fear of being left single. And they don't want it to happen. Sometimes parents married their daughter off as a minor because their community was very small. And if the father did not accept a viable son-in-law when he was available, he might get snapped up by someone else. That's Rabbeinu Peretz's notes on the Smak. Similarly, if he does not seize the opportunity, he may not have another chance. That's Rabbanei Tzafat, again, French-German rabbis. If a father died, the sages ordained that in order to ensure a minor daughter's well-being, her mother and brother can marry her off. However, since such a marriage does not have the status of a Torah marriage, if the minor wants to leave the husband they chose for her, she may say before 2 witnesses that she refuses to be married to him, and this dissolves their union. Based on her refusal, a certificate of repudiation, shtar mi'un, is drawn up. However, if she has not rejected him by the time she turns 12 and exhibits signs of puberty, she has become his full-fledged wife and wants to leave him, they would require an actual halachic divorce. Nevertheless, when it was not absolutely necessary to marry off a minor in order to ensure her well-being, the sages directed that even a poor man should not marry off his minor daughter without her wholehearted consent. Only when a girl was close to puberty, if she wished to marry a particular person, then it was a mitzvah for her father to marry her off with him. Now you have to remember, you're talking about 11 years old, 12 years old, in a world where people live till 25, 30, 35. My grandparents, who are not orphans or anything else, in Yemen got married at 13 and 15. By 15 and 17, they were living in Israel. That wasn't considered an unusual age to be married. That was when everybody got married. We could talk in a minute how that life looks, but for 1 second, if she was not interested in getting married yet, they would wait until she was. In general, the sages said that girls should be encouraged to marry early as soon as possible after puberty, so as to avoid delaying the fulfillment of the mitzvah of procreation. Additionally, doing so would protect her from the evil inclinations and enticements to act promiscuously. As it says, do not degrade your daughter and make her a harlot, on which Rabbi Akiva commented, this refers to a man who delays marrying off his adult daughter. When such marriages were made due to financial necessity, then even though the bride did not choose the groom, there was no shame in it. Many such marriages were happy and resulted in a thriving family life. But all of this is explanation. You could even argue apologetics. I'm not telling you this is the commentary on the sugya. The relationship would evolve. At first, the husband's attitude to his young wife would be paternal. As she grew up and developed her identity, they would become peers. As their connection deepened, she would become as a mother to him, taking care of all of his emotional needs. The sages used this development as an allegory to describe Hashem's relationship with the Jewish people in Shemot Rabbah. We must add that the sages instructed the husband of a minor to refrain from sexual relations until his wife reached puberty. The man who has sexual relations with a minor, even his wife, is deemed a child molester. The sages say that such a person prevents the arrival of the Mashiach, since the girl takes no pleasure in this, nor is she able to bear children. Okay, the last section was really meant for something else. If I can talk to, for a moment, the idea of getting married at a young age. So, I can tell you at least how it looked in Sfarad. I don't know elsewhere. In Sephardic countries, Jews lived in not just tight-knit communities, but tight-knit families. What it meant, tight-knit families? You know, in the West, I'm assuming in the United Kingdom it's similar to the United States of America, and that is, people, they go off to college, they disappear, they get married maybe, they come back to visit their parents on Thanksgiving, on Christmas, on, I don't know, Hanukkah, whenever they decide they're going to come visit their parents, and then they pay money for them to be in an old age home, and they die, and they cry at their funeral how much time they wish they didn't spend with them, and all those things. That's not really the way this worked in the East. In the East, it was a very different model of relationship, and that was, first off, family units were that much closer, people lived together, and not just together, but mamash together. So I'm thinking of Harav Peretz and his family's compound in Morocco. What does it mean? They have, imagine this here. So there are houses all along the perimeter, and there's a shared courtyard in the middle of this perimeter. And let's say your parents live right here, and your uncles and aunts, they live here, and your grandparents live here. And there's a bunch of empty rooms. And the reason there's a bunch of empty rooms is because you cook outside in the courtyard, and you play outside in the courtyard, and you work and talk and gossip and peel vegetables outside in the courtyard. You really only sleep inside of the house, maybe study in a room inside of the house. But aside from that, everything is done in this very safe, enclosed area in the middle of the courtyard. And so what happens? You're old enough to get married. Who are you getting married to? The girl from the next compound? Your distant cousin who lives in this corner? So what do? You get married. How do you pay your mortgage? How do you pay your bills? They give you a room. This room over here, they used to store the potatoes in. Now it's your bedroom. They put a bed in there, close the door, and you have kids. Who's going to help childcare? You send your kids in the morning to this courtyard. one day it's this aunt's job to watch the kids, one day it's that uncle's job to take care of the kids, one day and the whole family is taking care of each other. It's not so complicated in the olden days to do all of the things that Rambam says that a person, smart people, they get a job, they buy a house, and then they get married. He says stupid people, they first get married, then they get a job, and then they buy a house. That's wonderful when getting a house means a bedroom in your parents' house. Or that's wonderful when getting a house means putting up a shack, like a sukkah. You use some wood, some straw, and you sleep in it. When buying a house means $1.5 million with a $500,000 deposit, that takes more than just a few days to put that together. You might spend until people don't buy a house their whole life. Or you're going to wait till you're 90 to get married. So things may have changed in the world, which is obviously affecting this conversation. But back to our initial halakha here. The Rama says it's the custom in Ashkenaz to marry off daughters that are minors, which is against the will of Chazal. And Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine is saying these are two areas that are very sensitive areas. Our Chachamim explicitly ruled against them. Yet somehow the Rama has a way to get around it. And that bothers him very much. I was really going to get into two more examples today, but it's not worth rushing through it. So I'll tell you what next week will be. It will be a segue between Even HaEzer and Choshen Mishpat. The topic of next week's shiur is going to be on the rabbinate, the dayanut industry, the topic of whether or not rabbis are allowed to take money for providing the services that they do. And this is a fascinating topic because it was a war, a real war between the rabbis of Sepharad and the rabbis of Ashkenaz. The former not allowing acceptance of money at all for rabbinic duties, like the law of the Talmud, and the latter, if I say kindly, were very comfortable accepting payment for all of the jobs that were involved in the rabbinate. And there's an essential dispute between them. We're going to analyze the Mishnah, the Talmud, the commentaries on those, some latter-day sources, including a writing of Moriya Rav Yaakov Peretz, should live and be well, about this topic of whether or not one is considered corrupt in halakha if they are being paid to rule over those halachot. And I think that a lot of this has to do with much of what we're dealing with at Shiviti, whether it's in the world of kashrut or it's in the world of giyur, in a world in which the average cost of giyur, at least in the United States, I don't know how it is over there, out here, giyur can range between $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. If you're in a place like Arizona, I know someone who was quoted there $33,000 to convert to Judaism. If you're talking about kashrut and major organizations that won't even spit your direction unless you pay them X amount of money, $5,000, $10,000 to show up, you're dealing in a world in which money has become a primary focus of the rabbinic establishment. And I believe that the conversation next week will be relevant to all of us, because all of us in some way or another are affected by a rabbinic establishment that looks after their pockets. And whether it's correct or not is going to be a dispute, obviously, between Chachamei Sfarad and Chachamei Ashkenaz. But that's what that paragraph is at the bottom of page 27 in the writings of Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine. God willing, we will get to that B'ezrat Hashem together. I see that I brought here a few other sources from the Pnei Halakha. You're welcome to read them if you would like, but right now it's not for our shiur. I have no idea why some of these are in the note. Until then, I wish you a wonderful day. Thank you for learning with me. I'm here to answer any questions. I'm sure this topic might bring up some feelings or emotions. Please feel free to stick around and talk. I'm here. If not, I wish everybody a wonderful evening. Laila Tov, Tzedkam Shalom. I'll see you, God willing, next week.